This is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, March 28th, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. On Friday, March 14th, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney was officially sworn in at Rideau Hall, and with that, he revealed his selections for the new cabinet. In a significant move, Carney has reduced the cabinet size from 37 members, under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, to just 24, a notable trim. This reshuffling means that several former ministers have lost their roles, some portfolios have been consolidated, and certain positions have been entirely eliminated. One such casualty of this restructuring is the cabinet position for the Ministry for Women, Gender Equality and Youth. This marks a departure from Trudeau's cabinet, which was intentionally designed to reflect a commitment to progressive values, including a strong feminist agenda. Trudeau's cabinet also had gender parity between men and women. Carney's cabinet does not. With this change, Carney appears to be charting a different course for the government's priorities moving forward. Today on Rabble Radio, Rabble editor Nick Seabrook sits down with Jacqueline Neopol, the executive director of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. The two discuss what this removal means for gender equality in Canada and what's at risk for women and gender diverse people heading into a federal election. Here is that conversation. Take a listen.
Jackie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
So, first off, for our audience, could you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about the work you do and the work of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women.
Yeah, so the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women has been around since 1976, and we're a not-for-profit research institute dedicated exclusively to conducting and supporting feminist research for action on women's rights. So that's kind of the important difference with a lot of the work that we do, is that we're really focused on participatory action research and kind of bridging this divide between academic-based feminist research and community-based feminist research.
Okay, and to get a little bit more into the specifics, what are some of the specific things that you're researching, say, right now?
One of our major projects right now we're doing is a rise of regressive movements and its impacts on women's rights organizations across the country. So we've been looking at this for about 2.5 years to kind of just see how are regressive movements mobilizing across the country, and what are the actual impacts for women's rights organizations, and how can we work together, because the action component, how can we work together to counter this rise in regressive movements? So that's one major project. And then we've also, I think probably over the past 30 years, really focused on how, public sector precarity or any kind of austerity measures and their impacts on women's rights and gender equality. So those are kind of our two main projects that we have right now.
Yeah, and very relevant in this day and age, I think, seeing what's happening with the rise of Donald Trump, or the continued second presidency of Donald Trump in the United States, the effect that that's having on women. And of course, our topic of today, the removal of the Minister for Women, Gender Equality and Youth from the cabinet. Mark Carney announced his new cabinet about a week ago. It was a trimmed down cabinet, and the Minister for Women, Equality and Youth was not included in that in his cabinet. And I guess to start off, what was your reaction when you found out that news that there wasn't going to be a minister in cabinet for this portfolio?
To be honest, I was shocked. It was almost hard to believe. And we were actually in New York City for the Committee on the Status of Women. It meets every year, the United Nations Committee. And so a lot of my colleagues from other national women's rights organizations and feminists from around the world were actually all gathered at the UN when we heard this news. And it was really just shocking. I just almost couldn't believe it. I thought maybe there was a mistake.
Now, just to give our listeners, some context about the importance and the history of this cabinet position, it's existed in cabinet in one form or another since the early 1970s. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the importance of this ministry and what are some of the things that it's achieved in its history in cabinet.
So it started out, so after the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, that's kind of where this position came. It was a Minister of State for Status of Women. And so, over time, I guess the best way to look at this and this importance of this department is that it is the national machinery for women's rights. So for the advancement of women's rights. So we refer to the cabinet or to the department as the national machinery. It's one of the main mechanisms to advance women's rights in Canada. And so over the years it was maybe it wasn't a full department. And then in 2018 it actually turned into a full ministry under the Budget Implementation Act. So 2018 Prime Minister turned it into a full ministry, and that's when you see the larger budget and a lot of collaboration between the women's movement and feminist movement and Women and Gender Equality Canada. It became a more robust machinery at that point. And so it's really important, though, for that machinery and that position to be a cabinet position. It has to be central to how any government is going to operate if it wants to put forward equality measures and end discrimination against women.
So, in terms of the effect of this ministry being removed from cabinet, does this mean that there will be any sort of disruptions in funding or services or programs that are provided?
Well, I hope not. It's really hard to say really what's going to happen at this point. So, I mean, it still exists as a department as far as I understand, because it's legislated, it's a department. But I really, really think that the fact that it does not have a dedicated cabinet minister is a serious, serious problem. It is now in a very large portfolio. Like the minister currently responsible for wage, the culture and identity minister. He has parks and recreation. He has heritage, very huge, huge portfolios. And women and gender equality is just one of the many that has fallen under this broad culture and identity portfolio.
Okay. Now, obviously, I think one of the reasons why this announcement was a little bit shocking as well is that we're in the month of March. It's it's the month of the International Women's Month. So, what are your thoughts on the tone deafness of that kind of decision? And what's your organization doing in reaction to this move? What sort of campaigning are you involved in reaction to the removal of this cabinet position?
Yeah, I mean, well, that letter, we did write an open letter it's been signed now by, I think, close to 400 organizations in Canada across the country, and every riding, probably every little corner of the country, there's an organization who was signed on to this because there's a real sense of feeling betrayed. We know that there's a rise of regressive movements and anti-feminism across the world, and Canada is not immune to this. We can see it bubbling and sometimes bubbling over the surface. And so it really does feel like women's rights and gender equality were being pushed aside. And it feels like a very regressive move and a very overt aggressive move, regressive in the sense of, putting women's aside for the economy, and for dealing with tariffs and these types of things, and not recognizing that, a strong, healthy society requires human rights. It needs women's rights. We need to see those things realized. And so it really feels, and I think I speak for everyone who signed on to the letter, and for my colleagues too, is we really felt betrayed. And we felt that we had to stand up now and say something before there's a further erosion of women's rights.
And just to note that whenever Carney did announce his cabinet changes, he did say that he had a trimmed down cabinet to, quote, focus on the important things, which kind of also sends a message when the Minister for Women, Gender Equity, Inclusion is not included among that list of important things, at least according to the new Prime Minister.
Yeah, it's offensive.
Now, we've talked a lot about the history of how important this position has been for women, but let's also talk a little bit about the gender equality aspects and the youth aspects of this portfolio. So how will the removal of this cabinet position affect gay women, gender diverse people, and young women?
So youth is also interesting because it's technically a separate portfolio, right? So the last minister, Minister Ian, was the Minister of Women and Gender Equality and Youth. And I also like to mention too that seniors are also missing from this new, lean cabinet. And so I really think, with any, especially with an intersectional feminist perspective, which is what I believe that you're speaking to when you say this, is we need intergenerational women. So we need women in their diversity, young women, old women, middle-aged women. We need people in their diversity to be really putting forward a progressive department, a feminist department that's going to really, make sure that women's and human rights are realized for everyone. I think this is a really backward step that's going to have a lot of implication. It's not just a symbolic snub. I really do think that this is very significant, and it's going to have very significant implications on a lot of people in Canada.
You mentioned the joint statement that your organization and others signed onto in response to the removal of this cabinet position. In that joint statement, it mentions that this move is a betrayal of the Beijing Declaration and the platform of actions. Could you explain to our listeners a little bit about what those are?
Mm-hmm. So in 1995, there was the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was adopted, and Canada adopted it. And so it's one of the, like a very well-known women's rights declaration. And it has 12 critical areas of action for women's rights and gender equality. Canada, I mean, and no country has met all of the, critical areas. But one of them is about institutional mechanisms. And institutional mechanisms are really making sure that you are creating departments like women and gender equality and really institutionalizing human rights and women's human rights into all of your policies, decision making, budgets, and making sure that it's considered as part of all of those processes. And, we're 30 years later. So that was adopted in 1995. And to have such a backward step 30 years after that declaration was adopted is horrifying, actually. And we were all down in New York for this 30th review. And so we were at the UN. Feminists from around the world, thousands of feminists had, come to the UN to be as part of this 30-year review. And it was at the end of that week that we heard that wage had been eliminated as a dedicated cabinet ministry.
Now, Canada also has a feminist international assistance policy. What is that policy and how will it be affected by the removal of this cabinet position?
I mean, I think time will tell how all of these different measures or policies are affected based on wage and whether it's at the cabinet table or not. The feminist international assistance policy, that's under, I think, global affairs. And so you start to see which is effective. So you want a mainstreaming of feminist policies across departments, right? And I think one of the reasons why you would see that when you have a dedicated cabinet position is that you have somebody at the table with all the other ministers side by side, making sure that there's a feminist lens and feminist policies put forward on every department. And so, that's the risk I think that I see for the future is not being able to have those checks and balances at the cabinet level where you have a dedicated ministry and minister who's making sure to raise those key issues for every portfolio.
Another thing that was noticed about the Carney cabinet, unlike his predecessor, Justin Trudeau, who committed to having gender parity in his cabinet positions, Carney does not have gender parity. There's a slight majority of men in cabinet. Now, some pundits have speculated that this, as well as the removal of the cabinet position for women, gender equality, and youth, was a tactical choice by the new prime minister going into an election aimed at appealing to right-wing voters, and that if he's reelected, he might restore this position and maybe go back to some of these policies. I was just wondering, what's your thought on that theory that this is a political tactic? And what do you think of that?
Well, I don't know why he made those decisions. I can't, but I will say that I don't think that it was a good strategy. And that I think it does have political implications. Whether or not it was intentional, I'll let the prime minister speak to that. But I do think that it does have political implications, and it has implications for all of us in the women's rights movement and the feminist movement who have been working for these issues for decades. And all the feminists who came before me, this is a major step backwards, and it does have implications.
Now, as I mentioned, we are in an election now. On the one hand, it's really shaping up to be a two-party race. On the one hand, we have the Liberals, led by Mark Carney, who, as we've been discussing, just removed women and gender equality from his cabinet and has went back on that commitment for gender parity in the cabinet. And on the other hand, we have the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre. He's drawn some comparisons with Donald Trump in the U.S. Also, it should be noted that he's allowed members of his party to put forward motions in the House that would attack a woman's right to choose, their anti-abortion measures. So I guess, from your perspective, how are you feeling about this election as far as women's issues go?
Well, across all the parties, I haven't heard much about women's issues or women's rights, unfortunately. I am feeling, there's a global shift happening to the right and to anti-feminism and regressive movements, and we see it all over Europe. It's everywhere. So, I am feeling concerned about the direction the whole world is moving in. And I really hope that Canada doesn't follow suit and that we can hold on to what we hold dear in Canada, which I really think is about equality. It's about human rights. And I really hope that that is what Canadians think of when they go to vote.
Now, in terms of the important issues for women in this election, do you think, some important women's issues in this election that aren't being discussed enough?
Well, I think some of them are about holding on to our current gains, right? Like I think the national childcare system, that was feminists had been advocating for that system for 50 years, since the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. So, I think holding on to that, I think, a lot of other people could speak, depending on their organizations, could speak to other issues. But I think, making sure that women have the right to choose and, reproductive health and rights. I think all of those are big issues for women. I think having a dedicated wage cabinet position is a pretty big issue. And so I'd like to keep that on the forefront because, without having that minister there, how are we monitoring or evaluating or continuing to make progress on women's rights and gender equality? So, that's an issue for me, for sure.
Now, obviously, an election is probably the best time to lobby elected officials to influence change. So your organization has signed on to this open letter. What are some other ways that your organization is engaged in on this issue and trying to keep women's issues at the forefront, get that cabinet position back? What are some of the things that you're actively involved in?
Well, we're a charity organization, so we do, we're nonpartisan. And so it's just about, I think, talking about the issues and making sure that, people are thinking about all of the research that we've done, and on the issues and seeing what actions we need to advance women's rights and then making their own decisions about who they think is the best leader to push that agenda forward.
And we always like to include, a little bit of what I like to call some news you can use for our listeners who want to get involved. And say we have some listeners who are feeling passionate about there being a cabinet position for women, gender equality, and youth, who feel passionate about getting women's issues to the forefront in this election. And in general, just what advice can you give to some of our listeners who want to get engaged on women's issues and these issues that we've talked about today?
Well, I will say that, all of our organizations are underfunded. And so anyone wants to volunteer and get involved or donate, we're always, that's so helpful. And it also is a source of unrestricted funds where we can do stuff like write that open letter. Because otherwise we're really confined to project-based funding for the most part. And we always love to have volunteers of all ages, young and older women, and feminists. So, I think all of us, anybody wants to reach out and get involved and join. We're a membership-based organization, so people are also welcome to join us in our fight for women's rights and gender equality.
All right, fantastic. And we just have a couple of minutes left, but before I let you go, I just wanted to ask, do you have some final thoughts you want to share? Maybe something that I haven't asked that you feel is important to include in this conversation?
I think the only thing I want to include is, I think it's important for us to stand up to any backpedaling. And I think that's why it's important that it was collective. This letter is, signed by over 400, close to 400 organizations and individuals. Because I think we don't want to lose any progress. Any backpedaling or slipping is bad news. And I think it's really important that we make sure that, we don't want it to get so bad or before we stand up and say something. So I think anybody who might be thinking, oh, you should just wait, or you should wait and see what happens. And I think, I think the world is showing us over and over again that you shouldn't wait to see what happens, that you need to stand up when you see that something is maybe going in the wrong direction. Try to do a course correction.
Very good advice. Thank you so much, Jackie Neopol, for joining me to talk about this issue. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick, for having me.
That was Jacqueline Neopol, the Executive Director of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, and Rabble editor Nick Seabrook in conversation. Thanks so much for that, Nick and Jackie. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. Back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. In national news, the federal election kicked off this past Sunday when Prime Minister Mark Carney asked the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament. The race has quickly become a contest between the Liberals and the Conservatives, who are nearly neck and neck in the polls with a slight edge in favour of Carney's Liberals. Polls currently are less favourable for the NDP. Rabble parliamentary reporter Carl Nirenberg argues, however, that a strong NDP representation in the House of Commons is good for the working class. In this last session of Parliament alone, the NDP, in cooperation with the Liberals, were able to create brand new social programs aimed at improving the lives of average Canadians. These programs include dental care, childcare, and a national pharmacare program. In a column for Rabble founder Judy Rebick warns that the Liberals have shifted to the right under Mark Carney, making a strong NDP in the House even more crucial. Rebick recalls the last time that the NDP faced a devastating defeat at the polls in the early 1990s. The Liberal government that was elected at that time cut social programs like funding for healthcare, which still hasn't fully recovered. So far, Carney has favoured more right-wing policies in his short time as Prime Minister. He cut carbon pricing for most consumers. He also gave wealthy Canadians a break on their capital gains tax. A strong NDP voice in the House of Commons would be able to push back against this drive towards the right and protect the things important to many working-class Canadians. Also this week, the federal election did not get off to a great start for Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre either, thanks to one of his supposed allies, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. In a radio interview with right-wing American news outlet Breitbart, Smith said that she had spoken with unnamed officials in the Trump administration, asking them to delay their tariffs against Canada in order to help Poilievre win the election. Smith further implied that it would be better for Donald Trump if Poilievre won the election because he would be easier for Trump to deal with. As Donald Trump has placed tariffs against most Canadian goods and has threatened to annex our country, Smith painting Poilievre as a Trump ally has damaged his once commanding lead in the polls. In January, the Conservatives were leading the Liberals in the polls by 20 points. Now that lead has all but evaporated. Also in election news, in an op-ed on Rabble, the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada is warning of the impacts that a Pierre Poilievre Conservative government could have on access to sexual and reproductive health care in Canada and around the world. Access to abortion and reproductive care is already uneven across Canada, especially in rural and Indigenous communities. The Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada says that while a Conservative government likely wouldn't make these services illegal, they would likely underfund them to reduce accessibility even further. They also foresee a Poilievre government pulling Canada out of international organizations and initiatives that fund and provide reproductive care globally. In his time as leader of the Conservative Party, Poilievre has allowed his MPs to put forward petitions and legislations aimed at undermining the right to access abortion. While none of these have passed, if Poilievre won a majority government, this past behavior would raise serious concerns. The Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada states in the op-ed on Rabble, quote, "A Poilievre-led Conservative government would be a disaster for reproductive justice in Canada, especially for Indigenous communities already bearing the weight of systemic inequities." End quote. In Labour news, Canadian union leaders are making their interests clear in this coming election. Both the Canadian Labour Congress and Canada's largest private sector union, Unifor, have argued for increased employment insurance benefits to be campaign priorities for the major parties. With U.S. tariffs expected to increase in April, unions are arguing that increased employment insurance benefits will be needed to support workers who lose their jobs. Unions are also arguing for better funding for healthcare to help support Canadians during these difficult times, as well as higher taxation on wealthy Canadians and corporations to fund these services. Also this week, Rabble shares a review of the book Wrecked by Cole Thrush. A professor of history at the University of British Columbia, Thrush examines the history of the so-called Graveyard of the Pacific. For centuries, the North American coast between northern Oregon State and the southern part of British Columbia saw the arrival of many colonizers. Some of the ships bringing these colonizers sank to the bottom of the ocean. These ships met their fates at the hands of bad weather, bad navigation, or at the hands of some of North America's indigenous peoples. Thrush looks at how these interactions colored colonial indigenous relations and how some of these wrecks were used by European colonizers as a justification for the brutalization of indigenous communities. And finally, Linda McQuaig is arguing that in light of threats against Canada's sovereignty from the US, American companies should be barred from owning Canadian news outlets. The largest owner of newspapers in Canada is Postmedia, which is owned by the US-based hedge fund Chatham Asset Management, whose CEO, Anthony Melicore, is a donor and supporter of U.S. President Donald Trump. McQuaig writes, quote, "We now urgently need those newspapers to be owned by loyal Canadians committed to Canada's independence, not by a hedge fund aligned with a manipulative and deceitful powermonger who has designs on us." End quote. As always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thanks as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Narenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.